Okay, I'm Lola Marie Cathey, Lola-Marie-Cathey.
Great.
Pull that chair back.
Oh, sure.
We're gonna
We're not in the
we
questions
just
yet,
realized
so no
something
problem.
was in the picture.
Yeah, I just thought we'd pull that back.
Yeah.
It looks
Good,
kind of awkward
it's
to
good
have
to
part of the
spot
chair.
that now as opposed to later on when we see these pictures and we go, what were we thinking? We have this one picture of this one guy and he's talking and we didn't realize behind him there's a stapler on the shelf and it looks
Just
like
about to get his ear
gonna
off.
come get him. So it's good when we spot these ahead of time. So Lola, tell me, where were you living during the 1964 flood? And we'll have you answer in complete sentences just so that.
I was living right in this same house we're in today.
Okay. And your parents lived down in Shively. Tell me about where they lived in Shively.
At the time of the flood, they were running the store and the post office. And my dad called me about 4 o'clock in the morning and told me that it was going to flood bad, but he would need bread for the store to please call and order bread from one of the bakeries here, and he would come in after it. Actually, he never did get in here after it. The water came up so much faster than they thought it would. And one thing that bothered my dad is he said it came up in swells, like it would not come up for an hour and then the next hour it'd come up 3 feet or 4 feet. He said it was really unusual the way it raised up at that time because he was used to it raising in more of a even tones, I guess is what you'd call it.
Now, did they, where the store and the post office is, was that down in the Shively, in the flats?
In the flat, yes, it is in the flat. And what held it back was that railroad track kept the other side of the track from being flooded. Okay. So Marilyn, my cousin, of course, was flooded at her house, which was right across from the store.
Can we pause for a second,
sure.
Jan? Sorry about that. We're getting some reflection of the light in your glasses.
Oh,
Yeah.
are you comfortable taking your glasses off?
No, I'm pretty sure it's a...
Awesome, down here for you.
You don't mind taking them off?
No.
Oh,
Okay,
great. That'll solve that.
You better be sure I
new.
put them on before I take off and fall on my face. So.
Yeah.
This is good because you're just getting used to your new glasses anyway, so this is a good time to take a break from them.
Okay, good.
Great.
So let's start all over again. Well, not completely over again.
Yeah.
We don't have to have you spell your name again. But so tell me where you lived during the 1964 flood.
We lived right here in this house. We've been here for over 50 years.
And that's, what city is that in?
Fortuna. We're in Fortuna. First I knew it was flooded was when I saw a herd of cows coming up the road here. Somebody was saving their cows.
Moving them up to
high ground.
Yeah. And where did your parents live?
They lived in Shively. At that time they were running the store and the post office. And the Shively store had rooms in the back of it for them to live in. It was a 2-bedroom cabin type thing.
And that was where at in Shively?
It's if you're going in by the road today, once you go over the railroad track, it'll be off to your left and you can see it from there. It's still standing.
I have to look today when I'm down there. I'm going to talk to Marilyn's house, Tom and Marilyn's house.
Yeah.
Is it really close to that?
Marilyn's house will be on one side of the road and the store will be on the other side.
We'll need to get a shot of that. So your dad called you when he heard the water was coming up. Tell me about that.
Well, he called and said it was coming up fast and he would come in and get bread so that people had bread and everything. But as it happened, he couldn't get in. The road closed, as it often did, and so he couldn't get in to pick up the bread. So
was the bridge in at that time?
No, the bridge, they always took the bridge out because it was something the town had purchased, and they could take it in and out, and they would always take it out when the weather started getting bad and they were getting quite a bit of water coming up. Then they would take that bridge out.
And what did he notice about how the water came up that was different?
Well, he said it came up in stages, kind of. It would come up maybe 1 foot in this hour and maybe 4 feet the next hour, and then back to a foot again. He said it was really strange that in all the years that he had been on the river that he had never seen it raise quite like that.
Not even in the 55 flood, huh?
No,
Okay.
not even in 55.
Now, the store at Shively, he also sold gasoline,
Yes.
and he did something about that.
Yes, he did not want the gasoline to get into the water, so he was having everybody back their cars up, and he would fill them with gas for free just to get rid of that gas so it wasn't going into the water. There was one gentleman that said that he didn't want my dad's gas because it was regular and his car would ping going over the hill. However, when my dad convinced him that he would take the gas in his car.
Yeah. Well, good thing. How big? Do you know how big that gas tank was? If that gas had gotten into
I have no idea. He pumped gas for people when they needed gas. You know, they bought gas usually if they'd run out. Say in town there, well, they would come over and be filled up with gas.
Could you describe for people who don't know Shively how people make their living down there and what it's like?
Well, at that time, there was a lot of farming going on, and they sold produce from their farms. Some of them, like my dad, would also raise potatoes, because there was a gentleman in Eureka who would take most of his potatoes when he raised potatoes. And I can remember one time one of the ladies from my daughter's school called me and wanted to know if maybe my dad had something in his garden that they could use at the school. And so I called my dad, and he said, yeah, he said, I'll bring in a load for tomorrow. And he said, in the meantime, I'll call, I forget who the gentleman was, and tell him to deliver a ton of potatoes over there.
Were they ready for a ton of potatoes?
No, they weren't exactly ready for it, but they got it.
That's funny. Well, I've heard like Laura Scudder used to be in Humboldt County.
Yes.
Yeah, and they used to be potato chips.
Right.
They bought potatoes for potato chips.
Right.
And so that area was a real farming community.
Right.
But part of that is because the soil there is
very good. It's very rich soil, and it always has been. Even the year after the flood, you know, when it had all that flood stuff on it, it didn't produce as well that year, but it did produce.
Yeah, that flood brings all that silt down there.
Yeah,
and
right.
makes it a very fertile area.
Yeah.
So after the flood, what happened to these families who were displaced?
Well, some of them brought in trailers. There was I don't know who it was, but there was somebody provided trailers for people until they could either get their house clean enough to move into or rebuild. Some of them just plain had to rebuild, and some just packed up and didn't bother rebuilding.
Yeah, some of the people have talked about like trying to go in and clean up some of these houses and how it was.
My husband went out first. My dad got a message to us. He needed Dave to come out. And it was interesting. He had to go down to the Veterans Building here in Fortuna and get the permit to get to Ferndale. And then he had to go to someplace in Ferndale and get his permit to get over to Riedel and Scotia. And there he got his permit to go into Shively. And what my dad wanted to do was get things like washers, dryers, things that if they got the mud out of them soon enough, they wouldn't be ruined. So my husband went in a couple of times to do that. And then they started cleaning up their own place. And he started bringing things in from there. And I would wash them off out here before I tried to put them in my washing machine, because they were just absolutely full of that silt. And they were clothes and things like that.
Yeah,
I took
clothes
care.
and everything.
Right.
It seemed like everything was saturated.
I think the thing that bothered Dave most was that he was trying to get one of the dressers open so he could get the stuff out of it, and he was having a horrible time. And he said, my mother just went and picked up the axe and brought it over to him and said, you're going to have to chop it up.
Oh, wow.
Because they couldn't get the clothes, at least if they got the clothes out, they had clothes, you know.
Yeah, man. Just all that swelling on the wood and not being able to open it. So, and some of the houses, I mean, people talk about just going in with fire hoses and hosing
Yeah,
them out.
right, that's what they did, hosed them out.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just trying to get them dried out. Luckily, well, Shively, that it's not quite as humid as I think on the coast, but trying to get those houses dried out must be
Right,
difficult.
yeah. My aunt that was in Pepperwood told me that every day she would sweep or dust mop her floor, and the next day it would have to have it again because the silt would be back once
I
it
heard
dried.
people talked about like swirling it, keeping it swirling, and keep
Give
it from
it
settling and
flowing,
get it out the door.
Yeah, you wanted to get it out the door.
And just trying to clean all the curtains and all the wood.
All that stuff.
Yeah.
It was a major job.
Yeah. Any other memories, other family members who were affected by the flood?
Well, of course, you know Marilyn and Tom, and Marilyn's dad, Clinton, and my dad were always close. One of my friends that I've told you about, Winnie Trump, her family's home was, I think it was practically destroyed, but Winnie could tell you for sure if you talked to her. And I was trying to think who else. Some of them were fortunate enough to be on the other side of the tracks, and if they were on the other side of the tracks, they made it okay. My mother's only question to my dad when it was all over, she said, what's the highest piece of land we own? And my dad said, it's up there on that ridge. She said, that's where the house goes. And that's where they put the new house in. She wouldn't live down on the bottom anymore.
I've heard that story a lot from people.
Yeah.
You know, I was telling these guys about the Shively farm and how John Bianchi, he was down below and lost his house in the 55 and the 64 flood.
Right.
And then the county made him put it the third time up on the upper piece of property.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And so tell me what your parents' names were.
Clifford and Lola Cook. And
how long did they live in Shively?
well, Dad lived in Shively most of his younger years. Mom didn't live in Shively that long. And then they moved back into Shively from Bridgeville in 1937. My sister and I managed to have whooping cough for the 37 flood. So when they took us to the doctor afterwards, they wanted to know why they hadn't been brought in before. And there was no way they could get us in there. But then they bought property and homes, and they lived in homes for a number of years. And my dad worked in logging then. And then when he decided not to log anymore, then they went strictly to truck farming. He also grew alfalfa and, as I told you, the potatoes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, alfalfa's a good rotating crop.
Well, right, that's what he did. He moved his crops around so that they got the nutrient. Then I can't think of a word I want.
Nitrogen or nutrients.
They got stuff anyway out of the alfalfa that made it good to plant your vegetables in.
Now they had just moved that summer from Holmes Flat over to
Shively.
How did their property fare that they had been on? What if they had stayed in Holmes Flat?
They'd have been flooded again, because that time it flooded clear up to, there was somehow a log went through the house, and it was about that high up. And they would have been probably in worse shape than if they had done, if they'd stayed.
Yeah, bad choice between the two, though.
Yeah, yeah.
Which way do you want to have?
Go. The people that they were buying the store from lost their house, and so they said, well, if they wanted to, they'd just take over that house and call everything quits, and so that worked out for them, and they built a house up on the ridge where she wanted it.
Yeah, a lot of people who went through the flood live on hills.
Yeah.
We keep going to do these interviews, and everybody lives on a hill.
Yeah, yeah, you bet.
Yeah. Anything else? Any other memories of the flood? Now, you were here in Fortuna. How was Fortuna impacted?
Fortuna had a lot of water in it. Every place you see a little creek here, they all flooded. And so if they were anywhere near one of those, they flooded. The Eel River flooded. The dike broke just outside of Fortuna. I had taken my husband to work, and they told him, go back home, we can't work at all today, and the water was coming into the creamery, so we came back, and we weren't back very long when we heard that the dike had busted.
So he worked down at the creamery?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. That was... How soon was he able to go back to work after the flood?
Well, about a week later, they called him to come back and help with cleanup, and that's why I was hoping my son knew where he made a scrapbook of the flood, and it has a picture in it of his dad with mud in his face cleaning up at the creamery.
Yeah, that was one of the places they talked about hosing it out and a fire hose.
Yeah. Well, they went in and just shoveled it into wheelbarrows and took it out. That's what he was doing in that picture that Bruce can't find it, so.
Okay. Any other memories? How were groceries? Were you able to get groceries here in Fortuna pretty well?
Pretty well. Doug Edgman down here was always good at doing things like that, and he had a friend who had a boat, and they took the boat down to San Francisco or somewhere there and bought the bread and things and brought them up by that boat.
So they went out out of the Eureka Harbor?
Yeah.
And went all the way down to get food?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Well, you couldn't get out on any of the roads. They were all in a horrible mess.
Wow, that's amazing. I haven't heard any. That was the first time I've heard that a person went out and went all the way down.
I'm pretty sure that's what Doug Edgman did. I remember hearing it. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. Do you remember the aircraft carrier offshore?
I cried when it came in because we had people that we could get. They had already turned all the freeways into airports. You could fly into Red Crest International or Scotia International. Once they started with the small planes, that went on. That started when they had a lady in Riadale who went into labor, and they couldn't get her to the doctor. And one of the guys flying his private plane said, well, if you'd follow those lines, he said, you don't have any lights anyway, so if you'd follow those lines, I could land on that piece of the road and pick her up and get her into the hospital. So that's what they did, and once they started that, they found that these small planes could land a lot of places.
Yeah, and you say when they follow the lines, you mean cut the telephone poles?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that story a little bit, so that was good that you filled the rest of it in.
Yeah. Good. And if I knew somebody was coming in from Shively, then I went up to see if they had somebody to...
I'm going to have you just look at me because I'm attempting to talk to these guys too. If somebody was coming in from Shively?
I heard somebody was coming in from Shively, I would go up and make sure that they had somebody to stay with, and if they didn't, I'd hunt up somebody and they'd come and get them. So, as I said, my son remembered people coming to the house to pick up relatives and friends that were in need at the time.
It's good to have somebody who steps in like that and is kind of like the welcoming wagon sort of thing before they get farmed out to relatives.
Yeah. Well, they lots of times they didn't know that, you know, where if the relatives were home or anything like that, and apparently they didn't think about phoning them. So once I got them here, I'd phone for some relative or friend or somebody that could take them in.
A lot of the people, like when I was talking to Marilyn, she was saying, you know, I really, you know, I don't know that I want to be interviewed because I know I'm going to start crying.
Yeah.
Because her parents lost everything. And I just think about these people who lost everything.
Yeah.
My husband's family, they lived in Wiyot. They had a restaurant there. They lost it in the 55 and the 64 flood.
Mm-hmm.
How did you see people continue to go after that something like that happened?
They're very resilient.
Do you think, you know, people always talk about, you know, that generation was very resilient, or what do you think it is that makes people able to do that? What do you think in their lives?
Well, I think they've had things in their lives where they've had to come up to snuff, and they just naturally do that. It reminds me of one time when one of our governors came after one of the earthquakes, and he looked around and said he was surprised there hadn't been looting. And my son got very angry. He said, "Where does he think he is? People here don't loot."
That's interesting, because another story somebody told us, I don't know if you know Ginger Noons. She lives in Fortuna too.
Yeah.
And she was talking about how a news crew came up from Los Angeles after one of the earthquakes and was upset because it had been cleaned up.
Yeah.
Like the people had already got it in there.
Cleaned it up, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, great. Is there anything else that you feel like you wanted to tell about the flood?
Not that I can think of now.
I'm going to ask these guys if there's anything they think.
Yeah, Mrs. Cathey, I had two questions. How old were you during the 64 flood?
I was in my, 64, I have to add that up. I was in my late 20s.
Okay. Also, can you tell us when the flood actually hit its crest, do you have any idea how high that was in your parents' house, or the store, either one? Did it go above the roof, or was it up to the second floor?
Well, if you think of the log coming through the house that high up, it...
I'm sorry, if you just answer to Jan, we'll
Yeah.
keep going.
Okay.
Well, I don't understand. I was trying to get down there so she would.
Well, she was looking down, so I just
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
So you could just answer like you're looking at me.
okay, where was I?
You were talking about when he asked you how high was the crest in your parents' house?
My parents' house had the log come through way high up, so it may not have been clear over the top, but it was up high enough that the house was kind of ruined. It wasn't something you could put back together.